as weak and the male as active, vigorous and strong were emphasised by the style of dress worn by women and men at the time in support of this ideal of the separate spheres. And you can really see this in this image behind me, where you can clearly see that if you were wearing this dress, you wouldn't be able to do very many vigorous or active things. The seam on the shoulder is quite low down, making it very difficult to raise your hands up. The size of and the volume of the skirts made it difficult to move around, and the extremely expensive clothing really demonstrated the wealth of the wearer and of the wearer's family. So a well-dressed, fashionable woman in the late 19th century was an object of conspicuous consumption. Dress sent important signifiers of respectability and wealth. The women who did not conform to the tropes of respectable dress were liable to be lambasted in the press and within their own families. The relationship of women to their clothes during this period when fashionable dress could on occasion be both heavy and uncomfortable, with horsehair padding and metal or whalebone encasing and compressing the body, has fascinated scholars who have described fashionable women at this time as slaves. However, just like the severity of the separate spheres division, there were nuances in the relationship of women with their dress. And Linda Mead has rightly suggested that fashionable dress, quote, did not turn women into slaves or hedonists, but gave them space to explore desire and identity, end quote. So fashion could be a source of great pleasure for women in discussing and planning outfits and in attracting attention to their dress. Like, for example, Lady Fingal, who only really went hunting because she was aware of how sexually attractive she was in her riding habit, which she felt showed off her figure, which is her best advantage. Dress could bestow power on the wearer. An expensive dress, ostrich feathers and diamonds reinforced their membership of the ruling elite. There were advantages to demonstrating one's wealth and status through dress while out alone in public. As you can see here from what Lady Carberry wrote in her diary when she was in London. So she said in 1900, "Today I shopped in my stable, such an advantage." So she got free credit in one of the most prestigious department stores, and she got a perpetual permit to examine the most secret and precious manuscripts at the British Museum at her will. She was a very charming person, but the wealth and power that she gave off with her dress was very helpful. But today I'm going to look specifically at how dress represented key messages about the family of the wearer and about their position in society and their political allegiances. The landed elite in Ireland gained their prestige from their traditional power, wealth and status, and the women of this class used their dress to demonstrate this position. The painting behind me is a portrait of Ethel Quinn, who married the Quinn baronets in 1896. She was an extremely wealthy woman from an English family. So she brought a very large fortune with her, which allowed the Dromoland estate to stay in the Quinn family for another few decades. So Ethel as a wife represented her family and its powerful position in society. In being publicly exhibited at the Royal Academy in London, the painting, and by extension Ethel herself, became a display piece. With her strong gaze, she arrests the viewer and demands attention. Ethel Lady Quinn's position was such that she could demand deference in almost any social setting. Her position granted her opportunities that were not available to many men, women or indeed men at the time. The Quinns commissioned the classicist artist Herbert Draper to complete the work over the years 1899 to 1900. But his classical style of art was already starting to pass out of vogue, and modernist movements had gained traction. Draper's painting of Ethel was firmly stuck in the landed nobility's 18th century heyday. With the draped fabric, classical architectural features and colour palette, the painting could be mistaken for a painting commissioned in the previous century. And you can see here, there really is a similarity between this portrait and Reynolds' portrait of Elizabeth Gunning, Duchess of Hamilton and Argyll, which was first exhibited in 1760. Connections with the aristocratic tradition of 18th century portraiture may well have been welcomed by a financially straitened elite family, who had held considerable power in the previous centuries. And also for Ethel, who she herself, she wasn't born into a family of nobility, so she was, I suppose, making connections with this older tradition. Similarities can be seen in the women's dress in the two portraits. Both are draped in ceremonial ermine robes, a symbol of the membership of their families with the nobility. And neither woman was depicted wearing dress which directly reflected the fashions of their period, but rather an approximation of classical dress. Draper or Lady Quinn's decision to depict her in such stylized dress may have been an attempt to give the portrait a timeless quality, like the impression the family would like to give of their position in society, stretching back and forwards through time. While both women are depicted in some form of classical dress, Reynolds' portrait of Gunning is more sensual. This may be explained by analysis of Reynolds' portrait of Gunning by Robert Jones. He suggested that the representation of the widow Gunning in a state of diaphanous dress was reflected in her position as a public beauty, one who had lost her right to privacy and could expect to be gazed upon. There is much less of the female form in Draper's work, even though he was famed for his ability to render the female nude. Ethel was represented not in light folds, but in stiff silk which encased her body rather than embraced it. Women in both periods walked a tightrope of judgment between moral and amoral behaviour. In the late 19th century, when Ethel married her husband, commentators referring to such marriages as gilded prostitution, where women sold themselves in marriage for a life of comfort and prestige. Though in marriages like Ethel's, where she was actually the one bringing the money and the husband was the one bringing the prestige, the purchasing really might have been completed on the part of the woman rather than on the man. Echoes of such sentiments were already present in the mid-18th century, when a French magazine commented on the distinction between a fine lady and a prostitute being merely a technical one, that of cash payment. Judith Snyder-Lewis has demonstrated how aristocratic weddings in Britain developed from discreet affairs in the 18th century with only one or two members of the immediate family present, to quote the social extravaganza so dear to 20th century hearts. It was not necessary to use weddings as a statement of social position in the early part of the 19th century, because the position of unrivaled power held by the landed class in society had yet to be seriously challenged. But this was no longer the case when Ethel and Lucius married at the end of the 19th century, and the trappings of the wedding were used to add a veneer of prestige to the families involved. For families where neither husband or wife actually went out to work, marriage and the associated transfer of capital were essential to the survival of the estate. Weddings and the associated female dress could become symbols of both the economic strength of the couple and their families, and of their strong romantic attachment. It therefore became necessary to construct the romantic wedding. By 1896, virgin white was firmly established as the colour of choice for the fashionable bride, after the example of Queen Victoria in 1840. And Ethel did not disappoint the newspapers by choosing a dress of white satin, pointed beneath lace with a belt of pearls. She also wore orange blossom in her hair, which was a near uniform for wealthy brides, as it became a symbol of innocence, eternal love, fruitfulness, and marriage. And it was so linked to virgin and innocence that it was deemed inappropriate for a widow embarking on a second marriage to wear or to have orange blossom, because it was so much a symbol of virginity. The workmanship required to create such gowns made them extremely expensive. A distant cousin of Ethel's true marriage expected her mother to pay at least £100 in 1860 for her wedding, which was the same price as a carriage and a horse would cost at the same time. But she thought this was a modest sum for the dress. And Ethel's lace dress was obviously extremely expensive and suggested the wealth of her family. The Ireland that Ethel moved to when she married was not as politically stable as it had been. Both she and her husband were firmly opposed to the proposed Home Rule for Ireland. The imagery of the wedding highlighted these families' support for the survival of the Union of Great Britain and Ireland. And the design feature of the shamrock and rose was repeatedly used on banners, on decorative icing on the cake, and it was reported in the press. The bridesmaids also wore green sashes and large velvet green picture hats to match with white plumes and to carry on the Irish theme. And the Gainsborough style of the bridesmaids' dresses was their Marie Antoinette style, which was reported in the newspapers, hark back to the 18th century Senate with aristocratic power in Europe, while the shepherdesses' staffs pointed to a rural idyll where landlord and tenant were in harmony. Not the greatest bridesmaids dress there. These details indicate that this wedding was not just a religious and legal event, but was also a carefully orchestrated political statement, suggesting that the union of Great Britain and Ireland was as strong as the marital union of the new couple. The dress, decorations and wedding presents were all given extensive coverage in the local and specialised national press. Such coverage went some way towards attaching celebrity and aspirational status to the couple and emphasised their vast wealth. Accounts of the wedding in various newspapers were so similar that a degree of control must have been exercised by the family, or they might have sent in the descriptions themselves. And the detailed accounts of each individual gift, the exact description of the mother of the bride's dress, of rich purple and black shot silk with bodice of purple velvet, the sleeves handsomely studded with black jet, suggests that details of the day were sent to the press by the family, or that a reporter was invited to inspect the dress and the near 400 presents. And that's the mother of the bride there, just the right of the bride and groom. Marriage was a greater turning point in a woman's life than it was for her husband. The gifts received by Ethel were of a different nature than those received by Lucius, because she received numerous display items both for her own body and for her future home. She would use these to display her family's elite social position, and her husband gave her, among other things, an emerald and diamond ring and a gold O'Brien knot, which was the design which was found on a stone fireplace in one of the family's oldest castles, thus linking his new English industrious wife to centuries of O'Brien rule. From her mother, she received an emerald and diamond pendant, emerald and diamond bracelet, and a diamond star, and from her sister a pearl and diamond bracelet. Her stepmother-in-law, Lady H. Quinn, gave her a diamond and silver enameled watch. These jewellery pieces would mark out Ethel as a married woman. It was deemed appropriate that both the dress of a young matron be somewhat richer than that of an unmarried girl. So when another woman was preparing for her marriage during the autumn of 1882, her fiancé brought her a gift of lace because, as she explained to him, girls don't wear it, but it is the correct thing for married ladies to have some. It gives a certain cachet of matronliness which it would be seemly for your wife to have. This lace could then be passed down through the generations to be worn on wedding days, to mark the passage of a girl to a wife. Ethel Lady H. Quinn kept a notebook in which she listed the entire contents of her trousseau, the new clothes which she took with her on her marriage, as well as later additions to her wardrobe. It listed every single item of clothing she owned, from opera gowns down to underwear and night clothes. These were categorised by type under dinner dresses, day dresses, blouses, bodices, tea gowns, etc. And her clothing demonstrated the importance she placed on how she presented herself in public. This can be really seen when she expanded her wardrobe in 1889, 3 years after marriage. And by noting what items were replaced and updated, we can see what were seen as more important. So she updated her hat collection with 6 new pieces, 8 blouses and 11 dresses were also purchased, and a new white silk dress with a lace bodice, a new cape with pale blue chiffon collar, as well as a new white ball dress decorated with snowdrops and detachable lace sleeves. It was also necessary to buy a new Cork train to replace the one she had in 1896. But, for example, the tea dresses which she wore relaxing around at home, she didn't replace them, even the one she described as the old pink one. These things didn't need to be replaced, but the things which she wore in public were. So the role women played in creating their own appearance within fashionable limits is highlighted in a page in Ethel's notebook, which listed leftover items which she kept in the wardrobe room. And I noticed them all, but there's 7 brown bird wings and 8 1/4 yards of black balls with gold flowers, and the sleeves of her wedding dress which she had attached. These pieces of material were likely to be used to make a new portrait, while the bird wings would have adorned later hats, and the other fabrics can be found in the descriptions of her 1899 modern editions. The advent of photography meant that women's dress on particular occasions and the statements these made could be captured for posterity. Excellent Quinn went to fashionable London photographers to have her photograph taken on the occasion of her presentation at court, which could only happen after her marriage because her family were not deemed elite enough to have been presented earlier. And also on the right-hand side, her and her husband's attendance at the coronation of Edward VII and in Alexandria in 1802. In these photographs, both wear baronial ceremonial robes, and Lucius was fittingly dressed in military dress uniform with ceremonial sword. Ethel's diamond, pearl, gold, and other jewellery pieces, many of which were wedding presents, were a statement of wealth, but her outfit made a further confident statement about the couple. The heavy silk brocade dress was embroidered with large shamrocks and the O'Brien coat of arms on the front, you see in that photograph. And she now became an advertisement for the wealth and power of her Irish marital family, which, while proud of its Irishness, was firmly committed to the success of the empire and loyal to the crown. Across all these photographs and the portrait, a firm corseted waist is visible. Advice literature of the day was divided on the use of corsets. While they were deemed essential for health of mind, body, and respectability, one woman walked to her granddaughter, if you had a corset on, where would someone put their hand when they're dancing? Because the corset is so hard that it kind of protects the body. And there was some, but they were also criticised at the same time for wearing corsets. And there was some considerable conjecture that fashionable tight-facing or wearing women's corset too tight inhibited wealthy women's ability to carry a baby to full term, that it displaced organs and weakened the necessary muscles, making labour more difficult. The problem was considered serious enough for the prestigious medical journal, The Lancet, to publish a number of articles reporting on deaths of women deemed to be directly caused by the practice of lacing their corsets too tightly. Women who wore tight corsets were labelled as vain and misguided, and some believed that tightly laced women bore only idiot or crippled children. They were false. The abuse of the corset was listed in one of 5 plagues in 1857, which would cause the ruination of the whole human race. And the others being the use of tobacco, the passion for gambling, the abuse of strong drink, and speculation. If going without a corset, or indeed wearing one loosely, was deemed amoral, subversive, and deeply unattractive. And yet at the same time, the corset symbolised that their sexuality was modestly controlled and restricted. I'm slightly run out of time now to fully go into the corset, but I can discuss it further in questions after the matter. And this is just Ethel's stepmother-in-law, who had 10 children, but throughout her photo album, she is presenting herself with her corset tied, as you can see, incredibly tightly. And various letters discuss how women continue to wear their corsets while pregnant. One woman, when she was in the 3rd trimester of her pregnancy with her 3rd child, it was only then where she decided that it might be a good idea to take it off, that it was actually causing some of the discomfort that she had. So in the 19th century, to have no corset was to be overly sexualised, and to be too tightly corseted was to hinder fertility and the survival of family, class and race. Despite her classical style dress, the subject of Draper's painting is certainly corseted. To have been depicted with an 18th century waist like bunny, would have been to draw unwanted comment, but still, while possibly not considered a beauty, it doesn't matter, it's unwanted. So like for all married women of her class, Ethel's pride
when related to issues around pleasure, desire, as such, wasn't really appreciated or acknowledged in any significant way. And I suppose it's not really maybe an issue or a concept we're very familiar with it if we're maybe outside of the discipline of social policy, but we use it quite a bit, and I think in cognate disciplines maybe as well, to look at how far we've gone in relation to sexual politics more broadly. So when we think of sexual citizenship, I suppose we think of minority groups maybe looking for recognition, looking for rights, looking for entitlement to the society of which they are part. When it comes to children or young people, I suppose that's more problematic. Citizenship itself is a problematic concept when it comes to children and young people, but sexual citizenship, I think, is even more contested maybe and more problematic as well. And a number of scholars have drawn attention to that. I suppose another reason why I kind of came to this topic or issue as well was this study that was commissioned by the Department of Children and Youth Affairs in Ireland a few years ago. And broadly what we were required to do was to interview parents and set up some focus group discussions with parents around the issues of commercialisation of children in society and their sexualisation subject, and to explore to what extent parents were concerned about these issues. And we interviewed about 78 parents. Parents participated in all sorts of different kinds of interviews and focus group discussions. And I suppose it just happened to be at the time when the whole kind of furore or debate was going on about the child beauty pageant, the first pageant to be held in Ireland by Universal Royalty Beauty company as such. And basically, I suppose this came up, as you can imagine, in focus group discussions and interviews. And I suppose predominantly I found that parents interpreted this as the worst kind of nadir, if you like, or the worst kind of excess of the sexualisation of the child or the young person as such. So generally saw it in quite negative terms. I was going to show you a little clip from the Late Late Show where I covered the interviews, two with girls, one an American girl and one an Irish girl who was participating in the child pageantry, and asked them about their experiences of that. But I think I'm going to skip through maybe because I might not have time at the end, and I'm going to get to the end. So I suppose just, I'm not a historian, but I am aware that child beauty pageantry has a very long history. Many people connect to Barnum's Circus, which was way back in the 1850s when girls paraded around the circus ring. But also right throughout the 20th century, pageantry grew quite significantly. It was used to entertain troops, particularly in the 1920s. And again, right throughout the 1960s and 1970s, it really took off, I suppose, more commercial, organised society, etc. But the industry in the United States particularly really grew. It suffered a huge setback in the mid-1990s, and people may recall the murder of John Bennett Ramsey, a child who was involved in the pageant industry as such. And at that time, while it suffered a setback and there were a lot of connections made between paedophilia and child beauty pageantry, it did resurge again in the late 1990s and has grown quite considerably throughout the 2000s, and it's obviously become a much more global feature of our culture as well. Eden Wood was featured in the Late Late Show that night, and I suppose I've just focused a little bit on Eden. Here it is, two images of her, I suppose. One maybe somewhat stylized, but more natural look, and maybe the other more photoshopped image of Eden as she participates in the child beauty pageant. Eden has been interviewed quite a lot about her participation in pageantry as subject. She has a long history of it, I suppose, in the context that she participated in toddlers and tiaras. And she has also, through pageantry, become more involved in acting and singing and dancing and other kinds of activities like that in the entertainment industry as well. Generally, when she is interviewed, she says how she likes pageantry, how she much prefers it to being out in the family farm, and generally she's quite positive about her participation in the pageants as such, regardless of what we might think of it. The next image comes from Anne Davis, an Australian photographer, very commercial, very successful photographer as such. And I suppose the only reason I put this image there was to draw our attention to how we do also commodify childhood innocence, I suppose, in significant kinds of ways. But generally, childhood innocence is something that we're very comfortable with. It has, again, a long history. argues that very often contemporary photographs have to accomplish two contradictory goals when they photograph children. First of all, they have to make children look physically charming, but not intentionally. They have to make child bodies available to an audience, but without making those bodies enticing or even available. And then we have to enjoy the sight of the child and think the child cute, but not desirable, let alone sexy, maybe not even beautiful. And we have to make children kind of appear there, but not appear there. So that's what she argues is the kind of challenge, or I suppose, the contradictions that very often photographers have to work with when they picture children in many respects. And for that reason, I suppose, it just draws attention to how we commodify children in all sorts of ways, the innocent child as well as maybe what we often call the more knowing child. Again, people might be more familiar with this imagery as well. Pears soap that used a lot of images of children over time, and different kinds of images as well. Here we have, I suppose, largely working class boys. They also use a lot of racialized images as part of their advertising campaigns. And here they're depicted, what they want is Pears soap. But again, I suppose, looking at that kind of advertising, it indicates to us how the values of the wider society can feed into advertising and generally the pictures we choose in relation to representing children's lives. Different kind of image, again for Pears soap, maybe one that we might see more as an image of innocence, if you like. But it's interesting also to know that they did run their competitions for Miss Pears right throughout the 20th century, looking for what children they might use in their packaging promotions. And very often Miss Pears, who were successful later, went on to develop modelling and acting careers as well. I suppose people might remember as well when child beauty pageantry was being discussed in the Irish context or being discussed, particularly in the media. There was also a focus put on Irish dancing competitions as well, and maybe some parallels or comparisons made in that regard. And this is an image that was used to promote the dancing championship that was held in Glasgow in 2015. And on the left there we have an Irish girl and then two girls from other countries who were participating in the competition. So again, I suppose it's kind of an image we've become familiar with in relation to Irish dancing, the wigs, the tanning products, and the particular style of dresses, and the heavy makeup, etc. And of course, it's understandable that people make these correlations. Also, I suppose the Irish Dancing Commission around that period of the child beauty pageant in Ireland came under a lot of pressure to maybe tone down the image and to introduce regulations in relation to tanning products, use of makeup, etc. Largely as well under pressure by, I suppose, the government at the time. I suppose another part of our culture, the First Holy Communion, and again, I suppose it kind of traverses that concept of the innocent child, the more commodification that is associated with the communion event as well. I think this image is interesting because it traverses the notion of the kind of innocent child as well as the more knowing child, the child who's located in her context, her culture as such. There's the graffiti and the campaign to smash the H blocks graffiti on the wall beside her. But I think very often we tend to see images of children who make their communions in backgrounds of the family, not often in a setting that gives you a sense of a child who knows what it's like to live in the world around them as such. Equally, I suppose here are two images just of children. The first one maybe we kind of associate more with the princess culture that we're kind of familiar with, very often part of the culture of young girls, but very often associated with the communion event, the proms, the weddings, etc. Very much again, I suppose, the princess image as such. And then I suppose the other image of the girl maybe a more kind of blingy dress, and she's the jewellery and the accessories to accompany it. And again, I suppose, kind of plays with that notion of the innocent vis-a-vis more knowing child again that we think about in relation to constructions of children. So I suppose in this part of the paper, I just want to look a little bit at how different people have tried to interpret or read child beauty pageants. And the first one I'm looking at is the dominant discourse, I would argue, around how we've come to understand or see child beauty pageants or read them as such. And generally, I think we kind of are familiar with those, but very often they highlight issues like distorted body image, eating disorders, low self-esteem, lack of confidence. Also, I suppose they highlight a lot of physical effects in terms of the exhaustion of children who participate in these events, the stress that's induced by virtue of the focus on competition, the focus on beauty, which is argued is intense and unnecessary at such a young age, and also the kind of standard of perfection that's held out for children, which is perceived to be very damaging for them as such. Very often parents are fairly strongly castigated as a result of this literature and discourse. They're seen as kind of living vicariously through their children, projecting onto their children what they wanted but didn't quite achieve, and very often trying to fulfill their dreams through their children's lives. Also, I suppose very often this discourse or this literature or research very often argues for regulation of child beauty pageants to a much greater extent than they are at present. So they either look for all-out bans, as we've seen introduced in France, or they look for tighter regulation over the events and the kind of things that are permitted in relation to how the child should present or perform at these events as such. So that, I think, is the dominant discourse, and maybe it's the one we are most familiar with in the context of looking at the kind of, I suppose, debates that materialised around the child beauty pageant event that was held in Ireland a few years ago. So this is an alternative reading, but I suppose similar in some respects and different in others. I think Henry Giroux has been an ongoing critic of child beauty pageantry, and he very much, I suppose, argues that it is the myth of innocence of the child that makes such events possible to hold or possible to have as such. It's what gives the child beauty pageant its legitimacy. But he also, I suppose, refrains from viewing child beauty pageantry participation as a form of child abuse, which is kind of a tenet that comes from a lot of the psychological literature. He argues that there are two variable ways of organising, and there are two variable outcomes to make such an accusation. He also doesn't like to see them as part of the subculture in the context of America. He argues it's very intrinsic to American culture. Industry commodification of images as such is very much part of that culture. He argues that this is where there's a coming together of small town America, if you like, and then the ideology of mass consumer culture. This is where you see it at its kind of zenith or its height as such. And he views participant children as having no rights, no say, no adult advocates for their well-being and security, and he believes they're trapped in an exploitative world controlled by adults in terms of parents and by other, kind of commercial interests as such. So I suppose largely what his analysis seeks to do is kind of foreground capitalist consumer society at the heart of this, and he also argues that it's the product, if you like, of a divided society, that this is what has made child beauty pageants such a significant feature of society as such. So in that sense, I suppose it's a more sociological reading than maybe some of the earlier discourse that has largely come from more psychological framing of these pageants. Now I'm just going to look at a few feminist readings of child beauty pageantry. And basically, I suppose Kerry Robinson is an Australian theorist and analyst, and she's very much, I suppose, located in looking at issues pertaining to childhood and youth, very much located in the area of childhood studies. And she has been an ongoing critic of the whole conception of childhood innocence and maybe the damage that kind of construct of children can do as well in society. But in this article with Davies, she's looking at two films of child beauty pageantry. The first one, Painted Babies, in 1995, which maybe looks at the whole culture and looks at, again, I suppose, strong focus on the negative effects of beauty pageantry. And the other, the more recent film, Little Miss Sunshine, from 2006, which is a more satirical look at child beauty pageantry and looking particularly, I suppose, at one family, and Olive is the little girl in that family, and it's, I suppose, a family with a lot going on in many respects, and it looks at the whole child beauty pageant in a kind of a funny performance of his daughter, that's actually what she's doing. You're people begin to question it and criticise it. She does a Foucauldian reading of these films, or Robinson and Davies, I should say, do a Foucauldian reading, and they also draw a lot of Judith Butler's work on gender performativity, that gender gains meaning and hegemonic status in terms of how it's performed and practiced over time. And largely, I suppose, what comes out of their reading is that childhood and childhood innocence are highly contested and contradictory discourses as such. And they see very much that gender performances can be read in very different ways. So while the processes of objectification that I suppose we've become more familiar with over time in terms of how child beauty pageants have been read and discoursed, there's also the process of subjectification which we tend to leave to one side. So certainly we may perceive them to be objectifying in the context of dress and the kind of aging up, etc., pageant industry involvement, parent involvement, and all of those dimensions, and wonder, is this objectifying the child in many respects? There's also the subjectifying components that are there, where children very often see themselves as having their self-esteem built, feel good, feel confident, enjoy the performance dimensions of it, and they're very often, I suppose, inside the pageant community or the culture, and they get a lot from it. So while other readings, I suppose, tend to, fit with our conceptions of what a normative childhood should be, and I suppose speak to those of us who maybe are more critical of child beauty pageantry. Maybe Robinson and Davies tries to understand a little bit more, those people who are inside, who are getting a sense of community from this participation, who also enjoy the performative dimensions of participation in pageantry, and also maybe draw out a little bit more of the agency of the children. It might be restricted agency, it might be limited agency, we could argue, but nevertheless there is some agency there in many respects. And the other one, I suppose, I just wanted to focus a little bit on, because it is probably less conventional than maybe we've thought about as well, is Zaborski's reading of child beauty pageants. And she argues that they predominantly destabilise the realm of gender, that we expect gender to gradually unfold over time as such. And when children are projected into what looks like an aged-up performance for their age, it's very discomforting for us as adults. So she sees them as examples of aged drag, where children perform an age that's not of their own as such, they're aging up. And she argues on this basis that it can become quite disruptive of the kind of hegemonic construction of the child, and also it renders some of the boundaries that we've come to see between childhood and adult a little bit more dissolvable or problematic in some respects. So she argues it wreaks havoc with on the status and stability of the child's asexuality, and I suppose very often the discourse of innocence comes from a conception of the child as asexual as such. And she argues that while there's an urge on our part to read the child's performance as sexual, and very often we talk about child beauty pageants as sexualising, she argues there isn't a sexual element to it. And I suppose, over time I've come to be increasingly critical or worrying about our use of the concept of sexualisation, particularly as it relates to young women. And I suppose we saw that over the course of the study on sexualisation, where very often people believe this is not something that relates to boys, it's something that relates to girls, and that any kind of sexual performance or engagement on the part of a girl is problematic, seen as sexualising, coming from outside, coming from a kind of imposition by culture. But it's then problematic to know how girls or young women can develop a sense of sexual agency if everything becomes problematic or perceived to be sexualising in many respects. So she argues that there's, other ways of looking at this, and maybe it might actually subvert. Okay, it presents all the conventional notions or views in terms of their classist, heterosexist conceptions that are presented to children who participate in these events. But she argues that maybe there is a point of resistance there to the temporal ordering of girlhood unfolding over time, that the child beauty pageant can subvert dominant notions of gender and sexuality. It can very often upset the synchronicity between gender identity and sexual development. So she argues it causes age trouble in many respects. And so while we see children age up and they perform very often, and sometimes their play is very erotically motivated in many respects, we're less uncomfortable with it if it fits in with our kind of conceptions of respectable femininity very often. But children do perform age drag in other settings apart from the child beauty pageantry setting as such. So she argues that the sex those found in categories of child, adult and erotic that we as adults in society like to keep very separate in many respects. And she said generally childhood sexuality is something we as adults often tend to stitch over with convictions of innocence and asexuality. And I suppose in our own culture over time we've seen how that happened, where children were denied knowledge or information on the basis of their sexuality in case of awakened a dormant sexuality or a type of asexuality as such, rather than seeing children as sexual beings in the here and now. And I suppose that's the kind of promise that sexual citizenship maybe can hold in the context of seeing children very much in the here and now, rather than future beings as such. So just, I suppose, to put it together a bit and maybe draw a few conclusions. I think it is important disrupting our dominant discourses on child beauty pageants and maybe to provide some alternative readings of child beauty pageantry participation as such. I think certainly these events circulate and bolster white heterosexual class conventional notions of beauty and gender that circulate in our society. But they also subvert conventional adult conventional expectations of gender-based performance. And they also often flout some of the moral authority of experts on parenting and child well-being very often as well. Because while we all live vicariously through our children and while we all have this kind of concerted cultivation, some of it is possibly a lot more respected than others and maybe also much more classed as well. So I suppose the question is, can it help us, the subversion, reimagine children's sexualities in more progressive, more positive ways? Can it help us better acknowledge children's sexual citizenship in more relational terms? And can we also maybe take the focus of child beauty pageants and look at our broader culture to a much greater extent in terms of what aspects of it we're comfortable with and not so comfortable with, and what forms of kind of conventional adultist, classist, heterosexist, racist culture and sites that we have in circulation. And so I think there's a value in maybe looking at it in terms of our broader culture, rather than tending to look at it just as part of the culture of children and making it problematic because it involves children. Okay, so
beyond what somebody sees within the illness. very, very glamorous and grill creamed up and everything. In the mills again, she's obviously flirting with a man whose name I know, but I won't mention, it's not my father. And then very dressed up and very pushing barriers. And I love this other one with the hat and the trousers. And depicting a picture of a woman, not feminine, sort of very masculine woman. And whenever I see this picture, I know when I was a child, I wanted jeans and I was a cowboy outfit. I couldn't get one. I said, well, you were doing this at that time. So this is the time of pushing barriers in a very Catholic, conservative didn't go away. You see her here, she's in our conservatory reading, she was always an avid reader, but here she's having to, follow the letters on the newspaper. So we know there's something happening, we're not quite sure what. Again, she's eating, she can no longer, after a little while, she can no longer manage the knife and fork. So, but she can feed herself. So she's sitting down, and we give her a spoon. She uses a spoon to eat, and that's fine because she still has capacity, I suppose. What we did find at this time was the picture here. I think it's one of the loneliest pictures that I've seen. And I remember this day very clearly. It's Ross Castle in Connolly, and it was about she knew things were going really wrong for her. She didn't know what to do. And she could see her brother at this time had gone further into dementia. She could see what was happening to him. And she didn't know what her future was going to be. And she wasn't going to be in control of it. She was going, oh, what's going to happen? And I suppose the other one there, that glass of wine again, and that one is not drinking it. I said, oh, sure, get it. Keeping the connection through the loneliness. And what we found throughout these years was it was so important to keep that connection, to recognise the capacity, and to challenge that fatalism that, oh God, that's happening, just go away and turn the blind eye, go away from it. We wanted to engage with it and to keep her as part of the family, as part of the community, as much as possible. One good thing that happened here around this time was a smoking ban in Ireland. So we could go out with my mother and her chair and the dog usually, and we could go and sit outside in all the kind of smoking areas of town, and where she could meet people, and people were so scared then. So this particular occasion is a 50th sort of anniversary of our estate down in Kerry, which she was very much part of. This is also quite a disturbing time. It was a time when she was discharged from hospital. Once some of the medication she was taking didn't completely agree with her, and she ended up in hospital for a couple of weeks, January Acute Hospital, where they did not recognise her capacity, and also they didn't recognise her capacity, and they didn't recognise her need for to be physically sort of helped. So what happened, by the time to go into the story, was she fell and she hurt her nose and she got 2 black eyes. After which we got her out of the hospital as quickly as we could, and we all decided that she's not going back into hospital again. So you have her here bruised and very much damaged from barriers in the health system, which I would say still exists. But again, we were trying to bring her back and to our own care. Here again is the engagement in the community, with the green hat. My mother was always very actively politically involved. She always voted. I think if we didn't vote, it would be like, something would happen. But we always knew what she was who she was going to vote for. There was absolutely no question about who she was going to vote for. So as she became more unable to go and do it independently herself, we brought her to the voting booths when the voting time came, and when we made her vote with her, basically. That's my brother helping her to vote. This again is another occasion in our neighbourhood with my cousins and my aunts and our neighbours that she's very much part of. But you can see, although at this point she can't speak very much, but you can see her eyes are watching very much. She's looking to see what's going on. She came to my graduation, and again, that was something that she always wanted to do. And again, the other one here in the corner is just to show that, when it's not always active and, often went into the bed with her, and to again keep that connection and to keep that sort of closeness, I suppose. You can see people there giving her a glass of water or something, or when she was water mixed or anything like this. But again, you can see the connection, and she's seeing the other one. And so I put the one in London there as well, to show that I'm still here, still a person, still capable to the very end of communicating. And so that's, I suppose, what I think these photos can do for us is they can really show us how that fatalism of Alzheimer's can be challenged, and it can be challenged through the presentation of the image of a body, and to show that the relation being the breadth and complexity is always there within the person.
Rationalising or talking about participation in child beauty pageantry, they very often talk about giving their children the kind of cultural and social economic capital that they wouldn't get in other ways. So while I think child beauty pageantry is classed, there's different kinds of pageantry for different social class groups in society. I think there's been a stronger maybe focus, particularly in maybe reality TV, on the kind of trailer park culture around. But definitely, I think, in terms of how children and parents talk about this, and how children who participated in the past talk about it now, they don't always, I suppose the construction of them being always damaging and producing negative effects doesn't always bear through. So they talk about it confidence and their later rules or whatever, and again, I think very much they talk about it in those terms.
Has the effect been studied on the long term on children, and what kind of position in society the teenagers lead them to?
I think a lot of the psychological effects literature around sexualisation tends to start out first by looking for negative effects, so the scales that are used predominantly look for negative effects, so they don't start to see how much improvement is there in self-esteem. They start from the premise how much damage is done as such. They also use very often older populations because they can't often do research on younger populations as such. And a lot of it has been done on persons over 18. So again, I suppose there's issues there. So the effects is more about
I'm wondering if you could talk also about how your mother changed with Alzheimer's and dementia, because I think one of the, I totally agree with the challenge of fatalism, but the person is changing in a way that, you know, we're still trying to figure out and get used to. And so when my mother went through a similar process, I found that I had to be not relating to her always in ways that I had done before, and I think that's actually something that needs to be discussed too. I think actually for me it was very healing to look back through photos later, because I learned about my mother before she was my mother, in the period of time before she was married, which I really appreciated that first part. So there's something I think more intense that can be discussed, and I don't know if photography is the way to go about doing it. And that would depend on the person. For my mother, it was music, for example. Although images can be really important for not just the family, but for, you know, the relationship or the person that has dementia. So anyway, just a very big question in response to
I suppose the relationship, she changed quite radically in some ways. And from somebody who was very sort of dynamic, very sort of much in control, very sort of active, somebody who couldn't do all those things. And her memory kind of went, I suppose, and her physical sort of capacity also sort of deteriorated. What I suppose what we kind of tried to do throughout it was I kind of felt that there was, I also she was trying to communicate, but was unable to communicate in the way that she had been able to communicate. And I suppose people often ask that, well, did you remember that you were her daughter? Did you know? I mean, that to me doesn't matter basically. She knew that there was someone where she could be safe, I suppose. So those basic sort of things for sort of safety and security, and those they were things that she needed. And she also knew quite well what she retained was her likes and dislikes. And music was also very important. We had what's the name, McCormack, is it John McCormack? And there's a particular song or verse about Tralee, about the top of the rock and Tralee, which we had going over and over again. So bringing that in, bringing anything that would sort of communicate that this was an okay place was very important. In terms of physically, I mean, she went from sort of being a mother, cooking, cleaning, telling you what to do, to somebody who couldn't do any of those things, including personal sort of care and all that. But I think in changing those roles, you know, you don't know what's coming next. You just do them. You address what you have at the time. In that way, where you kind of communicate that this is all right now. I'm okay to get this over, or you know, and it's okay. So there's our physical capacity deteriorated, or mental capacity deteriorated, but that preference, that kind of essence of the person, I suppose, is what we were trying to get at, and trying to sort of speak to, I suppose, remained, and that sort of that communication of emotion, I suppose, remained.